All right, so I'm going to start off with Black Lives Matter co-founder describes herself as a trained Marxist. And then we're going to look at the guy who created Marxism, Karl Marx, and how he felt about different races and you know, what Marxists say. And it kind of does make sense that if they're a Marxist, right, why they treat blacks the way they do and how they think of blacks the way they do. And why they treat white people like they're superior. Because if you look at the ideology, that's exactly what it is. They say that whites have to do this for blacks, and because blacks aren't smart enough and not capable of doing it themselves.
Do you have an opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist and they're bad.
I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Would you go as far as say those laws are racist?
For sure.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
You can always get IDs you do over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
Do you think that's harder for black people to go online?
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
A lot of people have smartphones, but you might not have data.
For most of the communities, they don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
I also think there's a repression of black voting with how if you're a convicted felon, you're not allowed to vote and everything. And when you look at swing states like Florida, that's a huge population of the African Americans.
Really, is that blacks have been indoctrinated to be slaves, even though they have no chains, but it's just mentally. And until they understand that and they actually get up and stop letting people tell them they're victims, then it's not going to matter. Because the whole rest of America is waiting for them to get up and actually become productive. And I'm not talking about, I'm not saying they're not productive, but I'm talking about as a community, right? It's automatic lights. I said that in every video, but I'm talking about the hoods and all that stuff, because what they do now is only a few of them are productive, right? And then they've been told that you can't do this. So we haven't even tapped into the creative potential, and most of the creativity has been negative, and because they're always they're taught social justice stuff and cultural Marxist stuff. So, all right, we're gonna read a little bit about this, and then I'll play a video after this. Says Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrice Cullors, I don't know if I said her name right, but said in a newly surfaced video from 2015 that she and her fellow organizers are trained Marxists, making clear their movement's ideological foundation according to a report. Cullors, or I don't know, 36, was the protege of Eric Mann, former agitator of the Weatherman Underground domestic terror organization, and spent years absorbing the Marxist-Leninist ideology that shaped her worldview. See, the first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers, she said, referring to the BLM co-founder Alicia Garza. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sorts of ideological theories. And I like to think that what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many black folks.
In part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. And I think that what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many, many Black folk. We don't necessarily want to be the vanguard of this movement. I think we've tried to put out a political frame that's about centering who we think are the most vulnerable amongst the Black community to really fight for all of our lives. And I do think that we have some clear direction around where we want to take this movement. I don't believe it's going to fizzle out. It just gets stronger, and we see it, right? We've seen it after Sandra Bland. We're seeing it now.
There she is. I know that's going to get annoying, but there she is admitting that, they're trained Marxists. And maybe she doesn't know a whole lot about Marx, and maybe, she only reads selective writings. Lately I've been grabbing everything I can and just reading about socialism and Karl Marx in general. So we'll start off with, this is called Stopping Socialism. Karl Marx was a horrific racist. Here are the quotes to prove it. So I'm just going to read this one quote, and then I'll move on to another article. And I'm going to post all these links in the description of the video. So and I'm going to use some language here. So I'm just quoting Karl Marx. So the Jewish nigger, Lassalle, something like that, I can't say it, who I'm glad to say, I'm terrible with names, I'm glad to say is leaving at the end of this week, has happily lost another $5,000 in an ill-judged speculation. The chap would sooner throw money down the drain than lend it to a friend, even though his interests in capital were guaranteed. It is now quite plain to me, as the shape of his head and the way his hair grows also testifies that he is descended from the Negroes who accompanied Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or parental grandmother interbred with a nigger. Now this blend of Jewish and Germanus, on the other hand, and basic Negroid stock, on the other, must inevitably give rise to a peculiar product. The fellow's importunity is also nigger-like. Karl Marx. That's Marx to Frederick Engels in Manchester. I think it's a letter he wrote him. And then I'll read one more. It's Trumax. Prove that the common Negro type is the degenerate Trumax proved that the common Negro type is the degenerate form of a much higher one, a very significant advance over Darwin. Karl Marx letter to Frederick Engels in August 7, 1866. And then I'll read, I'm sorry. So this one's called The Ugly Racism of Karl Marx. And it's on the Daily Signal. May Day celebrations were held all across the fruited plain, with leftist radicals and unionists worshiping the idea of communism. Communism is an idea calling for the government control over our lives. It was created by Karl Marx, who, along with his collaborators, Frederick Engels, wrote a pamphlet called Manifesto of the Communist Party. In 1867, Marx wrote his first volume of Das Kapital. The second and third volumes were published posthumously, edited by Ingalls. Yeah. Let's see. Few people who call themselves Marxists have ever bothered to read Das Kapital. If one did read it, he would see that people who call themselves Marxists have little in common with Marx. So we would think, but it's kind of, his thinking is embedded in his ideology. So they end up having more in common with Marx than you would think, because a lot of Marxists are racist, even if there's a lot of black Marxists that are racist against white people. And they don't think they have this indoctrination, and they've indoctrinated whole swaths of our community to think that just because you're black, you can't be racist. That's how stupid they think we are. But I mean, it's worked. And it's because they've dumbed down our education. You ever wonder why even when Democrats get in power, the education system doesn't, the education of blacks actually often gets worse and not better? It's because they need you dumb, and they need you to go by consensus. That's why they have you enforce the black stereotype, which is funny because when white people stereotype you, you get mad. But then when a black person steps out of that stereotype, you also get mad, and you criticize him, and you try and get him to conform to that stereotype. Let's see. For those who see Marx as their hero, there are few historical tidbits they might find interesting. Nathaniel Weil himself, a former communist, dug them up for his 1979 book, Karl Marx, Racist. I tried to get the book, but it just cost so much. I wish I could, but I can't. It's a lot. It's like several $100s. For example, Marx didn't think much of Mexicans. When the United States annexed California after the Mexican War, Marx sarcastically asked, "Is it a misfortune that magnificent California was seized from the lazy Mexicans who did not know what to do with it?" Ingalls shared Marx's contempt for Mexicans, explaining, "In America, we have witnessed the conquest of Mexico and have rejoiced at it. It is the interest of its own development that Mexico will be placed under the tutelage of the United States." And they're basically saying white people instead of Mexicans, and that's what they mean. So Marx had a radical vision that might be interesting to his modern-day black supporters. In a letter to Ingalls, in reference to his socialist political competitor, Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx wrote, I think. So let's see. It is now completely clear to me that he is also proved by his carnal formation and his hair. His descends from Negroes who had joined Moses' exodus from Egypt, assuming that his mother or grandmother on the paternal side had not interbred with a nigger. Now this union of Judaism and Germanism with a basic Negro substance must produce a peculiar product. So that's another translation of it. Be as blunt. But let's see. Ingalls shared Marx's racial philosophy. In 1887, Paul Lafargue, who was Marx's son-in-law, was a candidate for a council seat in Paris district that contained a zoo. Ingalls claimed that Lafargue had 1/8 or 1/12 nigger blood. In a letter to Lafargue's wife, Ingalls wrote, "Being in his quality as a nigger, a degree nearer to the rest of the animal kingdom than the rest of us, he is undoubtedly the most appropriate representative of that district." And this goes on to talk about the anti-Semitism, I don't know why it's so hard, that, you know, Marx and like Engels shared too. So like this is embedded in their philosophy, in their economics and their philosophy are together. So in Marxism, this racial chord is in there, just like it actually kind of reminds you of Hitler, right? Inferior races. But let's continue. So another thing I want to talk about is let's talk about Antifa. So Antifa is basically, well, I'll just read it. Let's see, Antifa, what to say Antifa? I'm not going to read out the whole thing. I'll put the article down in the description if you want to. Was an anti-fascist organization in the Weimar Republic started by a member of the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. That existed in 1932 to 1933. It was primarily an active as a KPD campaign during the 1932 German federal elections and was described by the KPD as a Red United Front under the leadership of the only anti-fascist party, the KPD. So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, saw rising tensions between mainly the three broad groups: the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, on one side, and the Nazi Party on another, and a coalition of government parties, mainly socialist Democrats and liberals, on the other side. Berlin, in particular, was the site of regular and often violent clashes between communists and Nazis, especially sought to overthrow the liberal democracy of the Weimar Republic, while the Social Democrats and liberals strongly defended the Republic and its constitution as part of its struggle. All three factions organized on paramilitary groups. So, I'm gonna wait for this. So now you see, like, it wasn't like, oh, this brave group of anti-fascists. Like, no, it was communists who wanted power, and it was the fascists, and then those two groups wanted the power to overthrow the republic that was there. So they were actually against democracy, and they were overthrowing the democracy. Both of them wanted to do it. Both of them were fighting and doing it. That's why Antifa does the same thing as fascists. It's not because they're different than the fascists. It's because they were vying for power. So, like, this whole, like, righteous punch a Nazi, like, you should also want to punch a Marxist. And by their logic, because if you watch some of the videos, I'll try and find it, they, and I'll put it right after this, they constantly say, like, you know, it is love, you know, to punch a Nazi, or it is good to punch a Nazi. You're doing the right thing. It is not hate to do that, or to silence a Nazi.
Is it okay to punch a Nazi?
I mean, we did go to war against them. Yeah. So, yeah.
This week's top story. If you see a Nazi, punch a Nazi.
Liberals should not be raving about this.
The new segment we like to call up a Nazi.
My 90-year-old uncle, if he was alive, would have punched that son of a bitch in the face, and I would have had his back.
It was a hotly debated question for months after video of white nationalist Richard Spencer getting punched in the middle of an interview on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration went viral and inspired countless remixes. But the question was never really just about Nazis. It was about the acceptability of political violence. And in the following year, the question came up again and again as several high-profile political protests turned violent, including one on the campus of UC Berkeley. We visited Berkeley about a year after that protest turned riot to ask students whether punching Nazis or other deplorables is ever okay.
They want to punch the Nazi. We're not going to judge.
It depends on what you define as a Nazi.
The people whose words create a culture that sort of ratifies violence against a certain group are punchable.
On February 1st, 2017, the nation watched the University of California, Berkeley burn as masked members of the far-left group Antifa lit fires, threw safety barriers through store windows, physically attacked people, and threw rocks at the police. The protests turned riots were sparked by the arrival of right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, invited to campus by a conservative student group. President Trump helped ignite the controversy by tweeting a threat to
So, like, it is just as good to punch a Marxist and to silence a Marxist by that logic, because they're no different. So that black bloc that you see out there burning shit down, like, those are a bunch of racists. I mean, they take after a bunch of racists, and then they're also they're not much better than fascists. They're just out there to destroy stuff. So, like, it's time that the normal people, because the law enforcement and stuff isn't taking care of it. Like, if it happens in your neighborhood and you see law enforcement isn't taking care of it, like, this is not a call. This is if I was there, and like a lot of my boys and stuff, like, it's up to you to protect your neighborhoods, to keep it from burning down. So if you have to stomp some people out, because that seems to be the only thing that they understand, and since law enforcement isn't stopping them because they're the puppets of the governors, who a lot of them are in league with these people, like, it comes down to you protecting your own businesses, but it should be a coalition of you protecting your businesses and buildings. So, and that's white, black, man. If you guys are in the same neighborhood, you shop at that store, you go to that gas station, like, no, that has nothing to do with the state. If you're gonna protest the state, actually attack the state. And I'm not saying that you should, because you shouldn't. You should be peaceful protesting. But if you're going to do it, you should actually go after the people that are causing the problem, not burn down other people's businesses. That's retarded, and it's tyrannical. And so, if you get your ass stomped out, or shot or whatever, you deserved it. If you're a Marxist pig or a communist pig, it doesn't really matter. Or fascist pig. They're all sick dogs, but yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the racism in the Soviet Union too. So the racism in the Soviet Union was not like in America, because it wasn't from the government institutionalized down. It was actually more racism from the actual people in Russia. So. So here, the people of people of African descent did not have their African lineage indicated on line 5 of their internal passports and other documents. Instead, Soviet regime classified them as variously as Russians, Abkhazians, and other nationalities. This is from Official Discrimination Against Blacks in the USSR could not be legally instituted because they did not exist as a legal category. So their ethnicity wasn't actually really even recognized. Did discrimination against Africans manifest itself unofficially? To answer this, we turn to a noteworthy event in the 1960s in the first recorded political protest to occupy Moscow's Red Square since the 1920s. 500 to 700 Ghanaian, I don't know. Ghanaian, okay. 500 to 700 Ghanaian and other African students protested racial discrimination in the Soviet Union. Placards carried inflammatory slogans such as Moscow, center of discrimination, stop killing Africans, and Moscow, a second Alabama. The protesters were triggered by the untimely death of Edmund Asar Otto, a Ghanaian medical student. However, grievances about race relations had been commonplace for some time. In the 1960s and 1963. The Ghanaian embassy received so many complaints about unprovoked assaults by Soviet citizens that it requested a formal investigation. In studying this event, Julie Hessler found Racism was a genuine problem for the first cohorts of African students, and their concerns about verbal harassment, unprovoked assaults, and racial profiling by the police were based on everyday experience as well as word of mouth. Reports included students yelling, let's go lynch the niggers. That's crazy. At universities, a KBG informant reported that the Soviet students had extremely poor relations with blacks and mulattoes, who were referred to with obscenities and considered sadistic, dirty, hypersexual, and the source of syphilis outbreak. Girls who dated black men were reportedly viewed as worse than the lowest prostitute. So we see, when it comes to the government, we see it's a different kind of discrimination, right? But it's not as overt. But unofficially, when it comes to the people, it wasn't that much different. They still treated black people like garbage. So like when you're comparing it from there into America, and that tells you about a little bit about the ideology and the basis. Because when you're looking at Soviet Union, you're looking at propaganda, and there's a lot of propaganda. So like their image to the rest of the world is normally a lie, right? And then when you're there on the ground in person, then you start to see, like, it's not this grand, utopia. It's actually a hell. So I'm just saying, let's not get to like thinking that, and there's these other, like, you see this other propaganda, like it's better for black, like there's some other stuff, but you could definitely see that there's racial discrimination, and not just against blacks, in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Like a lot of times you see people discriminate against people who are like white or slightly darker or different, but it's more against like nation and races in different groups, or different places, right? Even in Africa, like different tribes massacre different tribes. So, yeah, so that's just a little taste, and I'm gonna, try and slide some videos in here. So, until the next video, kind of put down in the comments what you would like to know about, because I'm finding out a whole bunch of stuff about communism and Marxism. I had no idea. Like Karl Marx was a racist and didn't like Jews, and it's not very much like Marxist ideology is not much different than Hitler's, the fascist ideology. Actually, but fascism is not a stamp. Like you can't, just like communism isn't just a stamp. Like the different fascist countries, not all of them murdered Jews. Some of them saved Jews. So, yeah. But shalom, and I'll see you next time. Let me know down in the comments videos that you would like to see, or what you thought of this video, or how I can make it better. And if you're a Marxist or a fascist or a white supremacist, which is either one, like you could be Marxist, you could be, whatever, go fuck yourself. Have a good night.